This is August 3rd, 1995 at 113 North 3rd Street in Bayfield with Hal Noreng and stories of Sand Island and elsewhere.
Okay.
Hal, let's just start with your family in Norway. Where were they from? Who were they? What were their names? Where did they live?
Okay. The Noreng family, my father and mother, lived west of Oslo in an area called the Dallinghar, Lillehammer area, where really the Lillehammer was where the Olympics took place. And that's where they were from. And they decided to come to America, and they came here on their honeymoon. They got married in Norway and came here to the honeymoon. And they had relatives in Minneapolis, which was their destination. They came to New York and then traveled by train to Minneapolis, where he had a brother, Harold Noreng, living, that was married.
And what were your parents' names?
Bertrand and Birgit. Her name was Birgit. Nielsen was her maiden name.
Uh-huh.
And so they were married and then came to this country.
Do you remember their parents' names?
No, I don't, and I don't have any record of their names. I've been trying to do some research to find more information on that background, and I do have a cousin that's doing some research that in California at the present time. He's doing a history on the Noreng family.
We'll have to get him up here for an interview.
Yeah, it'd be fantastic.
But their name was Noreng, spelled the same way?
Yeah.
It wasn't changed?
No,
so many
no. There is some double spelling of Noreng. They often spelled it N-O-R-I-N-G, and there are, I always use the E-N-G ending on the Noreng name. So those are just the little differences that take place.
And did they come right to Minneapolis from New York?
Yes, they came right to Minneapolis.
And because he had a brother there?
Yes.
And what did he do there?
Well, after he'd been there for a short while, he got a job in a creamery. And after a couple of years or so, he became foreman of the creamery crew, where they made butter and milk and that type of thing.
Uh-huh.
And that was his main source of income at that time, was working at the creamery.
Uh-huh. And what did your mother do?
And she just kept house.
Uh-huh.
And yes.
What year was this again?
1908 they came to this country, so it was 1908 and 1909, 10 that they were living in Minneapolis.
And when were you born?
I was born July 8th in 1920, and for the records, I was the only child born on the island that still survived to this date.
Is that right?
And I think the farthest point in the United States, as far as I know, or it's certainly in Wisconsin, because that's the northernmost island of the island, so it's rather unusual. I was born at home, and my father assisted and also called in Mrs. Hill, who was kind of a midwife in that area, came, and later on in the day, Dr. Deason, who was from the Minneapolis area, had a cottage right on the bay on Sand Island. He also came out then and rechecked the situation and evaluated, and everything was fine, so he went back home. So.
Well, let's back up a little. When did your folks then come to Sand Island?
They came here to the island. He was intrigued by a land promoter in Minneapolis area who had a home in or a cottage on the island by the name of Bondi, or part of the law firm, and he promoted land selling at that area and told how beautiful it was. And my father kept thinking of Norway with the beautiful water and the land and trees and an island and the rocks, and so they just pulled up stakes, and the first thing you know, they took the train out as far as you can. They had a train that ran partway to Sand Bay, and then people in boats picked him up and took him over there and sold him a piece of ground. So it is really, he was really a pioneer at that time. He had nothing with him but his the tools that he brought along.
Well, how do you make a living out there?
Well, he started working in the logging camps and also in building, doing some building there. And of course, within a year, the Oakstroms was a family up in the middle of the woods, close to where he had bought the land, and he helped them do some building and worked on the logging type of thing until he had found the land and started cutting trees, and he built our own home there out of logs. Hewed the logs by hand and built his own home.
Now, where was that on Sand?
And it's about a quarter-mile inland from Sand Bay. That's East Sand Bay.
From East Bay then?
Yeah, East Bay.
Right.
Right.
And what was it in relation to? What was it next to? Or?
Well, it was just in the middle of the woods of nowhere. He just cleared the land in a small area to begin with and built his house. And then he worked, as they say, in the logging camps, continued that. Sometimes they had oxen they used to haul logs, so there weren't too many horses around in those days, and he trained oxen to haul the logs out of the woods, and also for the logging camps that were producing logs in that area, which was lumber being shipped.
Had he done that kind of work in Norway?
No, he had done some carpenter work and that type of thing, and worked with horses a lot in Norway. And so as soon as he could, he got a horse. And of course, then the farm started up. He got a couple of cows, and that then gave them milk and those type of products. And he started selling milk and butter, homemade butter, to the families that lived there. There were several families on the island, the Hansons and some of the Dahls and Hills, and many of the tourists that had Lawfills had a place in the summertime, and so he sold the products. And then he started a small farm and selling potatoes and vegetables and things like that. And so that's how he made his living, basically, until later on in the life. Now, they had two children that came from Minneapolis with him, or really three. William, my oldest brother, as Signe was the next oldest, and Helen was the next oldest, and they were all born in the Minneapolis area, and they came with him to the island.
So they were kids then?
Very yeah, they were children,
right.
And there were only like a few years between them.
Right.
And so.
Are any of them still alive?
No, they have all passed on. I'm the only living member of the original Noreng family.
Right. Well, what are your memories of being a kid in Sand Island?
Well, there are lots of fine memories there. They did have a school on the island, and I went to school there for 3 years. I started school in 1926. And they had a woman teacher the first year. The second year and third year, they had a man teacher. And I can't remember his name right offhand. But I remember that there were three of us children in school, the two Johnson family, Johnny and he had a brother also that went to school there. Oh, the Shaw boy from Shaw's, from the Hills. It was related to the Hills. And so it was a Johnny Johnson, myself, and the Shaw that attended class. And living space was limited, so the teacher lived in one of the classrooms, the girls' classrooms, and he cooked his breakfast in the boys' bathroom. So he would come and assign us our work in the morning to study, and he'd go back, and you could smell the bacon and those things frying while we were studying our first lesson, and then he'd come out and teach the rest of the afternoon. He'd disappear and eat part of his breakfast, come out again. So it was rather a unique experience at that time.
How many kids were around then? I mean, how big was Sand Island? You used to
Well, there were about, at one time at the height of there were about 21 families living on the island, and they all had children. And many of them, of course, came to town to go to school. But so we were kind of the tail end. Most of those children were born, except and lived there, were older, and they came to town eventually to go to school, like I did. In 1929, there was one year when there was no school teachers available, and so I went 1 year without any instruction or school instruction, and our family friends at that time, the Palms, or Howard Palm and his family, that was Ludwig Palm, they lived out there. It was during the Depression. It was very tough, and they had a hard time making it, and so they went without schooling at all, and I did get to town during that last year and start school at fourth grade in the low school in Bayfield. And they had me board with a family called England's, who was an old logger in town, but his family was there, and they took and boarded my brother Norman and myself. Well, so we got to go to school.
Where that house was?
Yes, it was located just kitty corner from the Norwegian church, the Bethesda Lutheran Church. It was the second house just across the street from that corner on Cooper Hill there. And that's where the England family was. And so during the school year, we lived with them, and then in the summertime, we went back home, of course, to the island to live.
And you graduated from Bayfield High then?
Yes, and yeah, I went to school until I graduated from Bayfield High in 1939, and from there I went toured around with a couple of friends from Bayfield here. Omer Nelson was one of them, and Arnie Lindquist, and we had an old Ford. We toured through colleges, and ended up in University of Wisconsin, where we had a friend by the name of Howard Black that lived on the outside skirt. He was going to school there, so he showed us around, and I thought, this is where I'd like to go to school. And so I made preparations. While I was going to school in Bayfield, as a junior, beginning of the junior year, I got a job at the Oldie Homes pharmacy. And so I worked and went to high school for 2 years and saved what money I got. The wages at that time was $3.50 a week, and I think I had to put in about 60, 70 hours a week. I would open up the drugstore in the morning at 8 o'clock until Mr. Holmes came down, and I was always late for school in the morning, but the teachers got used to it after a while and didn't make me stay after school.
Now, where was that drugstore?
That was located right on the main street, car from the bank. It's now a dress store, and I'm trying to think of the street names. I don't remember right offhand. I should have looked those up. It's right on the corner. Right, it was Myers Drugstore was on one side, and the bank was on the opposite side, and the door faces kind of at a kitty corner. And that's where Holmes had his drugstore for many years. So, and then I would relieve the druggist at noon so he could have his lunch. And then after school, again, I went down and worked till 9, 10 o'clock during the winter hours. In the summertime, it was usually 11, 12 o'clock at night before I got to come home. But it was fun. I was probably one of the few people that had a job at that time, and so it was fun, and I met many of those people that come in as customers when I came home for the homecoming this year, the 50th anniversary, and they said, yeah, I remember you always giving me a little extra Coke or a little extra ice cream when you had a malted. It was kind of fun visiting with them. So.
Well, let's get back to Sand Island a little bit. Now, didn't your brother Bill become a fisherman?
Yes, yes. My father really started fishing early in the year, fishing for his own benefit mostly. He had a 12-foot rowboat with a small motor on it, an Evinrude motor that had a square tank on top that held about 3/4 of a gallon of gasoline, and he would set hooks out in the around the Sand Island Light area in this 12-foot boat, And then he'd had strings of hooks fastened to a meter and floats that probably was like about a block long. And then he'd lift those trout would come up that were caught on the hooks, and then he'd take those back to the island. We'd always had fish, plenty of fish to eat. And then he'd sell the rest to the fishing boats that came out, the Booth, Turner, and there was another boat from the Bayfield Fish Company that also made a tour out there. And that seemed to be a good way to go eventually, and as my brother got older, then they got a bigger boat. But I remember riding with him, my father, sometimes out to catch fish in that 12-foot boat, and the waves were higher than the boat were. And I don't know why I wasn't scared to death, but I enjoyed watching those huge trout come up off the water. And my father had a gaff with a big hook on it, and he'd see that thing swim underneath. He'd say, I gotta wait till he comes back, and then he'd take that hook and gaff the fish and throw it in the boat. And some of those things were like 18, 20 pounds, and they were flopping around the boat. It scared me half to death. And that's how he would, but then we always had food. And I often tell the tale of people I meet later on, and I wasn't aware of such a thing as a depression until I got to university, and friends that I knew there would say, well, you know, I remember the depression because my father spent most of his night gathering coal from along the tracks, and if he got a pailful, he could trade it in and get a loaf of bread. And my father was very self-efficient. We had always had meat on the table or fish. He had his own smokehouse and smoked the hams and bacon. And my mother canned the meat, and we had our own garden and apples. So we always had plenty to eat.
Yeah.
And my mother never forgot her traditions of living in Minneapolis. On Sundays we'd have company come out. She had the linens and fine china and silver from Norway that she had brought along, and she laid a table out for people who would come to eat, and they would just shake their head. Here we're out in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and here we lived beautifully. We never knew what there was to be hungry.
Yeah.
Just loads of food. And we picked wild berries, and my mother made jams from the wild raspberries and the blueberries. And our cellar, which was a huge, it was built with double walls, about 5 feet of dirt in between. And that became a cellar, root cellar, to keep all our vegetables and things that she canned. And they preserved beautifully. The potatoes in the spring, after keeping all winter, were just as solid and hard. And of course, a lot of that product was sold to the visitors on the island in the summertime, and even some of the other people that lived there, because he produced really good food, vegetables.
But your folks stayed out there all winter too.
Yeah, they stayed there all winter long.
Yeah.
And I do remember so excuse me a minute. I do remember in the wintertime we'd want to go home for Christmas, and we would walk across the ice. They'd usually meet us on one side, and then we'd walk across the ice to get home in the wintertime, all the way from Hokinson's, which is up in the up about 4 miles north of Little Sand Bay, and we'd have to walk down through the snow to that area. And sometimes if it was if the ice hadn't frozen over, then we'd have a difficult time getting back or getting over there, because the ice was, until it froze, which sometimes would only give us, you know, a few days at home.
Yeah.
And during the summertime, or when water was opened, my brother Norman, who was with me at the time going to school, we would get a ride from the Moles down as far as the bay. And we had a system worked out that when we wanted to be picked up, if we were down there, any of the family from the Norengs, we would go to the right of the little river that was there and build a bonfire and build smoke. And we'd pile the wet smoke from the swampy ground around there. And someone on the other side of the island would see that smoke coming and knew where it was, and he would come over to my father's home and say, "You've got some friends, your son or somebody's wants to come back. Yes, I see the smoke on that side. That's for the Noreng family." And if it was on the other side, that would then, if we saw that or the family saw that, then it was for the Johnsons or the Hanson family. And then we'd go over and give them the message that you got friends or relatives coming home, you better get over there. So we'd sit and wait until we saw a boat coming across and hoped that we'd get picked up so we could get home. But it was a rather unique system. Yeah, smoke signals, and that's what it was. They knew where to look for the smoke signals. In fact, sometimes there were friends that were coming, and we had told them about this, and then people would come up and say, you got some friends or relatives coming because we saw the smoke over there. They'd jump in the boat and go over. So that's how we had messages back and forth to come across, to come and get us.
Now, who were some of your other childhood friends over there?
Well, the Johnsons certainly were very good friends of ours, the Herman Johnson family. There was Eddie and Johnny was the youngest, and Eddie, and then Martin. And so we played with them quite a bit. And of course, Howard Palm was a constant companion of mine during the summertime. We always made rafts and were down in the water all the time, pretending we were sailors. We'd put logs and nail them together and float around in the bay, hoping the wind didn't carry us out too far. But it was very delightful childhood. I'm very grateful for the time I had there. And often I would, when I was smaller, I would travel over to Hills and sometimes stay overnight with Johnny Shaw, which they were watching, was a nephew, I believe, of the Hills. And would stay there, and then sometimes he'd come over and stay with me on the farm. Mm-hmm. So that was a part of our childhood there.
So you didn't miss out anything by not being in?
No, not at all. I had a real glorious childhood, and so it was a lot of fun. And we'd often travel to the lighthouse by running the rocks, we called it. We'd follow the shoreline and go over there, pick blueberries, wild blueberries along the way, and then come back again. Always adventures.
Now, when you were a kid, was there a keeper? A keeper wasn't there at the lighthouse?
Yes, there was a keeper in the early part of mine, but I hardly remember him. There was a lighthouse keeper by the name of Lewick, and I remember meeting them, but I was quite small at the time. I was like 4 or 5 years old. Mm-hmm. But my family spoke often because they visited back and forth with the Lewick family. And there. So my father, I think probably was 6 or 7 years old. The Mole family, Elvis's father, had a logging camp on the opposite side of the island. And we would often ride with him in the wintertime back into that woods and go to the logging camp. And I think my mother might have cooked there a while, but I remember we got there one morning about 10, 11 o'clock, and we were hungry, and the cook made pancakes, and they were like 12 inches across, and whole slices of ham that were huge, and put on our plate. Of course, we were hungry, traveling through the woods, and we thought that was really great. We had all of that good food that the logging cook, that was the head of would make for us.
Do you remember Elvis's dad's name?
Louis, I believe it was Louis Moe. Something like me. Yeah. His name was Louis Moe, and he was quite a fisherman. He was one of the and Fred Hanson and Mr. Johnson, Herman Johnson, were the main fishermen on that side of the island, and so. Sometimes my father would probably work for them, and I know my brother worked for Herman Johnson for a while, and then he got his own boat and started fishing in earnest, and then they really did well with the fishing. And
this was Bill you're talking about?
Yeah, it's Bill Noreng, my brother, yeah. In the winter that I didn't go to school out there, my brother taught me how to mend nets, which they had to patch the holes in the twine, the nets that they used to set. And the nets are about 500 foot in length as a whole, but they always got holes in them, and they had storms and roots and logs would catch on them. As they lifted them, they would tear holes in them. And they were very expensive, so we had to patch them up. And so I would sit alongside of my brother and mend nets in the wintertime. And since there wasn't any school, I would, the only reading we had was the old Western pulp magazines. And that was my recreation, was reading Western magazines. That's the only thing we had to read.
Sure.
So that was quite an experience. And sometimes I would go down and Fred Hanson would take me in and sit me down where he was mending nets and visit with me, which I thought was rather unusual because he was kind of not a child type of person that really liked kids, but we got along well together.
You were about 9 then, is it?
Yeah, about 9 years old.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's right.
Well, how come you didn't go into commercial fishing?
Well, you see, I went to school, and I guess I just got caught up in it, and I knew people were going. I wanted to continue school. I did pretty well in school in our grade, and some of the teachers said, yeah, you really should go on to school. And after I got down there, after visiting the university, John Black had taken us around because he was in his second year down there, and took us to a football game, and I just got turned on. And so at the end of that summer, a friend of mine by the name of John Harrison that worked at the Old Home Pharmacy with me, we both teamed up and went down, found us off a room in Madison and registered. And registration at that time was $40 for the semester. And I'd saved about $270 out of my $375 an hour job at working at Holmes. And Mr. Holmes convinced me, you need to get into pharmacy. And I thought, well, that was pretty good. He was making a good living. But your preliminary classes, of course, were pretty much the same the freshman year. But I was impressed, but I had to have a job to stay there. So after we registered, we went looking for jobs, and I found a meal job. And if you could find a meal job, you could make it in a restaurant.
Oh, okay, meal job.
Yeah. So worked an hour, and if we worked an hour, we got a 35-cent meal. And so we'd work between classes, and then at night when they were busy, we'd be down there either starting in the kitchen, usually washing dishes or peeling potatoes. And for a while that went on, and sometimes when the next semester we'd probably find another job. And I got a job working in a sorority for a while, washing dishes, and that was pretty good because it was close to where I was rooming on Johnson Street. And so we managed to survive by having a meal job, actually. And then, yes.
Now, of your class in Bayfield, how many went on to college?
As far as I can remember, there were probably only about 6 of us that went to college out of our class.
Yeah.
Now, some of them, I think, probably went to other classes. Those that came from Bayfield, Justin Walstead was a friend of mine, and he came down at the same time. He graduated that same year. And so he came down, and it was a Betsy Iverson who was 1 year ahead of us. She was going to school down there, so we had contacts from Bayfield for some of those people on and off.
Yeah, because that's a big change.
Yes, it was quite a change, yeah. And I know Ted Oakestrom, which is who I graduated with. I think he started there for a year, but then he ended up going to our rival university, which was in Lansing, Michigan. And he ended up going over there, I think the second or third semester. He went to the University of Michigan in Lansing. But I often would run into Justin Walstead. And then there was a Dan Palm down there too, who was related. His father had lived on the island during hard times and was a cousin to Howard Palm. And Dan was a very brilliant person that was doing well in school, and he would often help with some of my math or something like that because he was very good at helping out. and he went on to graduate. He was a year ahead of us also.
So what did you major in?
I ended up, well, I went to school for 3 years, and I switched my major from pharmacy because I had to take French and Latin. I had really trouble taking Latin, and my French teacher always said, Hal, she said, you speak French with a Norwegian accent, and I think you're going to have a hard time. And I studied that class terribly hard, but I always had the Norwegian accent, so it didn't work out and in the language area. So I switched my major over to business administration, and started then my second year. I started taking courses toward my business administration degree. And this is in around 42. That's on 41. I remember very distinctly being out with, I think it was John Harrison, and we'd had a couple of dates. We'd gone out into the woods, and we got back, and this is January 7th. It was on a Sunday, and the announcement came through that Japan had attacked at Pearl Harbor. And we said, well, we know what's going to happen. So a few months later in the spring, I finished school that spring, but I signed up for the Air Force. And so...
so you'd been 3 years?
Yeah, 3 years into school at that time. So that early June, we got assigned, and I ended up in San Antonio in basic. And since I'd taken ROTC, which is a military thing, and you could get a credit for that time of taking and I was one of the few, so I ended up with all these guys that were on the train. I had to get them off the train and show them how to march in line, and I guess maybe I probably got better treatment out, but at least it was a lot more responsibility than I wanted at that time. And we ended up in San Antonio at basic schools there, going to school and working toward becoming a pilot. And from there we went to, we were transferred, if we graduated from there, to Bellinger, Texas, where we had basic training in single wing planes called the PT-19, which was our first plane we flew. And it was kind of frightening because once we started flying, you'd have a roommate, and we'd talk when we got back in the morning, and they'd say, well, George is not here, he's gone, he washed out. Or this one, I came home one day and found my roommate was gone, he'd washed out. And it got kind of scary because, our goal was to become a pilot. It was just lucky I had a real fine instructor, and I soloed in 5 hours instruction. He put me on the plane one day and said, it's all yours. I said, no, not this. So I went off and I passed and got pretty good grades in flying, and so I went on to train as a pilot to a basic class in San Antonio, in San Angelo, Texas, way in the west part of Texas, and then to Mission, Texas, which was the advanced flying school in the southern part of Texas near Mission, McAllen, Texas. And I graduated from there in January 7, 1944, got my wings.
And then what?
Well, from there I went on, and then they were being assigned to various combats. Some people went into multi-engine training, and others went into the fighter training. And I kept applying, wanting to get into fighter training, and they were always passing me by, and I never could figure out what was happening. But I was never being assigned to. I wanted to get into combat and fly the P-38s. That was my goal, was to get into that. And then you had to go to a special school. And meanwhile, of course, we all took gunnery and all the classes we needed for that fighting thing. But I never got assigned. And I'd had some twin-engine training, and I'd been sent to San Angelo again, where they were doing bomb training for cadets. So I flew that, and then all of a sudden I kept putting in, wanting to get back to fighter school, and I got transferred back to Mission. And I was there a week, hoping I could get assigned to a fighter group. And the commanding officer found out I had twin-engine experience. He brought me to headquarters, gave me a job in statistics, and said, "You're my pilot. So there I was. I was a pilot for the commanding officer. When he wanted to go someplace, he called me up and said, I got to fly to San Antonio, or I got to fly this way, or wherever he's going to go, so get your flight plan ready. And I became his pilot. So I never did get overseas, and I was very disappointed, but I guess I had it pretty good
exactly.
at that time.
You were in a safe spot.
Yeah, I was in a safe spot anyway. So that's where I got hung up.
And then after the war, where'd you go? Did you go back to school then?
Yeah, and I went back then and got out of the service. I stayed in the reserves, in the Air Force reserves. So I went each month. I took training twice. We'd have meetings every weekend, and then 2 weeks a year I had to go to a field and finish training. But I went back to the university and signed up for my classes because I wanted to finish school. I'd gotten married when I was after I'd graduated from the pilot school, and it was a girl I'd met in Wisconsin when I was working with Miss Cronert up in Solon Springs, and so we were married. She was at that time got transferred to Houston, and she was very musical, and she was the principal violist for the Houston Symphony. So we got to see each other again on and off, and so right after I graduated we got married.
What was her
in
name?
Houston, Texas. Rachel Williams. Her father was a professor at the University of in Superior, and so that's how I met her, and we were married.
What year was that?
And that was in 1944. I was married January 9th, 2 days after I graduated. My sister came from California, my mother. They spent the winter out in California, and they came to the wedding and had a big wedding with all the music we wanted, with the orchestra, all our friends from the symphony playing. So it was quite an event. So that was kind of unusual.
And then, so then she came back, and you guys lived in Madison again.
Yeah, then we went to Madison, and we lived there.
Did you have children then?
I had one child at that time, and we named her Hildy. And so then I graduated in the spring, and I got a job right after graduation with Sears, Roebuck and Company in their management training program. And I was sent to Oshkosh, Wisconsin as my first training assignment. So that's how that went.
And at this time, your folks were still on Sand Island?
Yes, we used to come up here and visit quite a while. My folks, before they built this home where we're sitting right now, started coming to town in the wintertime. Most of the people had moved off the island in the wintertime. There were just a few families stayed. The Hills were there yet, and the Hansons. And so it was pretty rough going, and so they moved to Bayfield in the summer, at the wintertime. And for I think it was 2 or 3 winters, they lived in the 3rd story apartment. They had our flat on the in the building across from our home now, which is now Mary Rice's home.
The Night House.
Yeah, the Night House. It was known as the Night House. And they had that apartment up there for 3 years that they stayed there.
What years were those?
That would have been 47 and, let's see, 40, 45, 40, 40, 45, 46, I believe they were there. Probably 47.
And they built this house when?
And then they started building this house in 47. They'd purchased the land. I was back looking at the deeds in 46, and they started building in 47 and finished it in 48. So then they moved, of course, into the home here. And so.
And didn't live in Sand Island at all?
Oh, they would come back. They'd go back in the summertime to fish. Yeah. So that's they'd come back and still fish out of there. And of course, it was getting near that time when fishing was more was getting less and less. But they still went back in the summertime to fish and make a living fishing. Bill was usually pretty much in charge at that time, because my father was getting fairly old at the time. But they still liked the farm, and they'd sold most of their cattle and things at that time when they came to town, and so they would just stay there and, as a summer place while they were fishing.
Right. And when did that house out there? When did your family move out of that house?
Well, the house they lived in that was about a half a mile back in the woods from Sand Bay. It was quite a ways, and when they'd gotten rid of some of the animals and didn't feel like you wanted to work so hard farming anymore, why, they built another house just across the roadway from Herman Johnson, who had his summer. He had moved from the lighthouse area over to the Bay area and built a home there, and just across the road we built a house. My father built his own house, and Brother Bill, they just built a house and bought part of the barn thing back down in that area, so they had a couple of cows. They had sold all the other animals, so they had their own milk and stuff. So that's how they happened to be there. So, and then as people more and more left the island, and they decided to build this house in Bayfield and stay here.
Did they? What year do you suppose they then stopped going to the island?
I would say probably in 1950, 49 or 50. They pretty much. And I think Bill went out for a couple of years afterward. He and Elvis worked together, I think, for a while, fishing too, especially during the herring season when the runs went on. And then my father would get a job down at the Booth fishery during the herring seasons and earn extra cash. So, and he did that for years.
And how long did Bill fish then?
Oh, he fished up until he had a new boat built. The name of Bobby, and so he could get into harder weather. It had a cabin over the top and all that. And he fished on until the fish started dropping off, and that was in the mid-50s when the lamprey started coming in and fishing became very difficult. And then it became so difficult, it was difficult to make a living, really. So in the mid-50s, he kept the boat for a while, but he got a job with the steamship company out of Superior and Duluth, and became, after a year or so, became an engineer, worked as an engineer on the boats, and that's how he made his living and stayed there until he retired. Oh gosh, in late 60s, early 70s, he was still working. I think he retired in the early 70s, like 71, 72. But he worked all that time with on the boats out of the big ore boats or shipping boats they had that traveled the Great Lakes.
And then, when he retired, did he come back here then?
Yes, he came back here to live. Yeah, and
His
then
house?
Yes, he was married in the. He got married in about 51 or 52, I believe, to a Frida, what was her last name? And so then they occupied the upstairs apartment, and they kind of fixed it into an apartment, and my folks lived downstairs. And she worked at the sand. She was the main cook at the sanitarium. And then he went, of course, boating, and so then in the wintertime they were lived here together, and Bill earned extra money mending nets for some of the people who needed nets. I remember one was an Indian that he mended nets for, and several others. He'd kind of pick up a little extra cash for that during the winter months when they were laid off. So.
You know what, I'm going to have you move a little bit because you're getting some sun. Yeah. Move toward me.
All right.
Just a little.
Is that better? A little farther?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I get refocused here.
Okay.
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 Well, let's pick up the strain of your life again. Last I heard you were in Oshkosh.
Oh yes,
So what
with
happened?
Sears.
Yeah.
Well, then I got transferred. Been there so long, and had taken several jobs in my training area, and then I was sent to a catalog office in Austin, Minnesota, for a short while. And I was there a short while. Then I got transferred to Lincoln, Nebraska, as a merchandise manager, and I was there during the 50s, mid-50s or so. And then I was transferred again as an assistant manager to Kearney, Nebraska, and I spent about 8 years there. And then transferred to, I got a managementship in Maryville, Missouri, and I was there for several years, and they finally closed that store. And so then I went a different direction, and I eventually ended up in the healthcare field as an administrator. I took administrative courses, and I'd moved back to Rockford, Illinois at that time, where Rachel had a sister that was teaching there. And there I studied and took the state board exams for administrator of healthcare. And so I became administrator of a large nursing home there. It was about 200 people in the nursing home, and I enjoyed the job very much. It was a completely different life from the hectic retail business.
Now, what year would this be?
That was in 1970, 69, 70, 72, and I was there several years. And the firm I was with was owned by some people out of Appleton, Wisconsin. They'd built a home. They had bought a home up in Grand Rapids, and it was a big home. And they asked me if I would be willing to transfer to that area. So I went up to see it, and it was a great brand new home, big nursing home, skilled care, with about 100 and some employees, and we had 207 residents. And so I moved up there to Grand Rapids. And so I was there until I retired.
When did you retire?
And I retired from there in 1985. I retired.
You've had 10 years
Yeah, as administrator.
and 10 years of retirement.
Yeah, 10 years of retirement at that time. So, so I've enjoyed it since then.
And Rachel has died?
Yeah, she had died in the early 70s. She had passed on. Yeah, and so that's when I was single for a while, and then I married another nurse that I had met in Rockford, Illinois, and they sent her up to where I was, and we became good friends, and we got married. And then she died in 87. She wasn't a very well person, and she was from the Rockford area. And so I was single. I was single from 1985 until I got acquainted with another lady, which was Marcia Reed. And we were friends I maintained the house in Grand Rapids, and we became good friends. And on my birthday this year, July 8th, we got married after several years.
Never too late.
Never too late. And so we're very happy, and we enjoy each other and the things we do together. And she's with me here today.
Yeah.
So it was kind of our honeymoon back in Bayfield. She loves the town. She just wants to come back all the time. She made several trips up here when I'd rented the house to people and maintained their apartment upstairs, and so we could spend a couple of weeks up here every summer.
And so you came back to Bayfield fairly often?
Yes, quite often. Almost every year I'd come up here for 2 weeks.
It's a hard place to stay away from.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful country, and still a lot of good memories, so we always enjoy coming back.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much.
And what happened? What about your daughter?
I had 3 other children.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Well, let's back up.
When I was living in Rockford, and in fact they were born before that. After Hildy was born, I had another daughter. His name was Linda, and then 2 sons were born, and one was Mark, and the other is. And they lived in Grand Rapids with us for several years. Bruce was my oldest boy, and then Mark was the youngest. And my daughter Cindy went on to become a nurse. She married a person in Kansas City. And Linda went on to college and got a degree in chemistry and engineering. And she was kind of the bright one in our family. She had carried twice as many credits as she was supposed to, and she just had straight A's all the way through class. They had lots of scholarships to continue school, and ended up working as an engineer for Commonwealth Edison, which is the power company in Illinois, a big car company, and got into nuclear work. She was very smart in math and this type of thing, and they hired an engineer. She was the only gal running around about 4 feet, 5 feet 1 inch tall, and she worked as they started building a new power plant, and she had all these big bruisers running around, and she was running and making tests and testing for whatever the chemists do for the water and all this thing, and she's still with the firm and down in management and in a large plant in Illinois, and still the only gal working in that capacity.
And what about the other kids? Where are they?
The other son is one son that lives in Joliet, Illinois, and just works as part-time carpenter and stuff. And the Mark, they both went on to electronic schools in Chicago, and I used to see them quite often. Mark got a job in California, in Hayward, California, with an electronics firm, and did real well in his field, and would often be sent all over the country troubleshooting for the electronic firm, where they made the silicon wafers that are used in all the electronic equipment that's being built today. So he's doing real well. He just came back from Germany a few months ago. They'd sent him over there to study possibilities in laser, which is a new field that's growing very rapidly, and got to meet a lot of the professors and things in Germany, which is quite an interesting trip he had there. So he's still in that field and lives in Hayward, California yet. He's not married. Neither of the boys are married. The older daughter is married to a chiropractor doctor, and now lives in Kansas. When they came up for our wedding, so we had a nice reunion.
Are there other Norengs around?
There are still my father's brother Harold Noreng, that lived in Minneapolis, which we're very close yet, and that was Helen Noreng. She married an Olson, but she still lives in Minneapolis, and so we conversed quite a bit. In fact, after my wife died in Grand Rapids, she called me one day and said, "I have to house sit in England, Helmsley, England. Would you like to come over and help me house sit for 6 weeks?" I said, "Well, give me a few minutes." So it wasn't, and so she said, "Well, I have to go now, but you come next week." And so next week I got on the plane and ended up in Helmsley, in England, and spent 6 weeks there, which was very, very great, seeing the country. I rented a car and put on 2,000 miles seeing England from one end to the other, including Scotland. Played golf at St. Andrews in Scotland, which was a highlight of the trip. Of course, we visited a lot of the a lot of the churches around York. There's a lot of history of Norwegians' early settlements there, which was surprisingly enough.
Yeah.
And so we had a great time. Although I did, when I was in Grand Rapids, I'd made 2 trips to Norway to visit relatives and friends in there, and I've enjoyed that. Some of them came to visit us in this country. But that was enjoyable, so I have done some traveling and enjoyed it very much.
We got about 5 minutes left on this tape, Al. There any other stories, particularly about life here?
In Bayfield?
Yeah, or Sand Island.
Yeah, Sand Island.
That you thought you'd wanted.
Yeah, I'm trying to think some that would be nice to share with you at this time, except.
Now the bells go off.
Yeah. Time's up, as they say. Your time's up. Well, I remember traveling across. They were quite vivid trips across to get to the mainland. At Christmas, we had to go over to get the mail, and I'd go back. I remember one trip, my brother was going to take me back so I could get to school, and we tied a rope around each other because the ice was thin in spots, and my brother Bill would go ahead with the ice chisel testing the ice. When we got about a quarter mile out from the Hills Point one day, trying to get back to the island so I'd get back to school, and he threw the ice chisel ahead of him, and he had it wrapped around his hand because the chisel went down through the ice and disappeared. We made 180, came back to shore.
That's right.
But I quite remember that quite well. I was about 12 years old, I think I was 13 years old at the time. And I do remember huge snowstorms that we had on the island. And one time, you'd only get out of the house, get out the second story window. We had so much snow. It was a winter with a lot of snow. And so we've had, and remember, a lot of trips on the lake where it was very stormy and wondered how we ever got across the lake. And because at the present time I belonged to Power Squadron, I became commander of our Power Squadron in Grand Rapids, so I got acquainted with all the boat safety features there, and our purpose was teaching boat safety. And I remember relating the incidents of traveling across the water, no compass, and snowing, and yet found our way from Sand Bay to the island. It's kind of scary sometimes, and we're crazy for doing it. Today I say, what are we doing out there in that rough water, because it could get nasty out there. So,
but there weren't any drownings or anything?
None that I recall that I remember, and we spent a lot of time in the water. And I often wondered why my parents let me go down. I was just a tot, and would go down to the lake shore and swim 2 or 3 times and dive off the dock, and they never worried about us drowning at all. We never seemed to worry about it at all. And we were always down when we were youngsters. And of course, our father was very good about taking us, and Mr. Hanson, they'd go over to the little Sand River and we'd go fishing. We'd camp there, and I thought that was great. I was like 6, 7 years old, and they'd take myself, my brother Norman over there, and Jake Hanson and Fred would go over there and put the tent up, and we'd walk Sand River up and catch brook trout and cook them out over the fire. And I thought that was the greatest thing in the world down there. He was very good about taking us along when we went to different places for picnics and things. And so that was really, I had a really enjoyable childhood, and I've been very happy. I've had a good life. It's been really great.
Yeah.
I wouldn't trace it with all the experiences I've had. And I'm still involved, and now as I got older, in a lot of volunteer work with Kiwanis Company. I've been a president of the Kiwanis Club in Grand Rapids for 1 year, and we do a lot of volunteer work and raise monies for the children. Our theme is Children Number One, and we raised thousands and thousands, 40,000 last year we raised. And many of our members spend time with disadvantaged children in school, and a very, very great group of people to be with. And most of them are my age in that particular group for the Golden K. And
So you haven't put your feet up?
No, I'm busy. I have a place in White Lake, a trailer I keep there, and so I go up there, and year round we go there and go fishing and swimming, and it's really nice to get away in the summertime.
Yeah.
And I'm more busier now than when I was working. I'm involved with our home, and we have my wife Marcia loves flowers. We have a very lovely flower gardens all over, and when the neighborhood paper comes out, we always get commended for our looks of our yard because we have so many flowers. And we enjoy that. Both enjoy flowers. So, and she's really great at helping out and doing things and going places. So, really enjoy. It's been an enjoyable life, and I can't say it hasn't been really great. Really great. And I've enjoyed meeting you and talking to you and learning about things that have happened here. I think it's really great.
Well, thank you, Al.
All right. Thank you.
We're coming to the end of the tape here.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.